1961 saw the publication of a novel which was entitled Too Long in the West. Its author, Balchandra Rajan, has often been accused of having spent most of his life abroad. But here he is with us in India in the studio today, and it's a great pleasure to have him with us. I believe you are covering Hegel in your book. And Hegel, belonging to a nation that was not involved with the imperial game in India, the French were, the Portuguese were, along with the English. How does Hegel treat India, and how does he get involved in this discourse, shall I say, of dominance?
Hegel's treatment of India is extremely abusive. One scholar has observed to me in correspondence that Hegel did, after all, devalue everything else in relation to the Germanic. But I think that we examine the specificities of this devaluation, you will find that India comes in for much harsher treatment than China, than Islam, or Greece, or Rome. That the rhetoric of abuse in which India is characterized is marked by a ferocity almost that we see only in Hegel's attitude to Africa. And if we see it in Hegel's attitude to Africa, it is probably because Africa was the only continent available to a newly arriving imperial power such as Germany. I wondered why the abuse is abuse of that intensity. One of my problems has been not simply to quote and in that way mark out the excesses of Hegel's rhetoric, but also to ask myself why this success was necessary. At the opening of Hegel's chapter on India, there is a description of India, and more specifically feminine India, as characterized by an almost unearthly loveliness, as characterized by a beauty which is not simply the bloom of physical radiance or physical vigor, but seems to be lit from within. And as one proceeds through this apparent eulogy of India, one finds it faintly disturbing. It's not what you expect from Hegel at all. The philosophy of history is not written in that manner. And then he suddenly turns around on his creation, sweeps it off the page with an imperious gesture, and says to us, the more you look at it, when you really start to look at it, the more unworthy it seems in every respect. And he then goes on into an accumulating tirade against India, which, as I've already pointed out, is quite singular in its intensity, even in relation to the adverse remarks which Hegel keeps on making about other civilizations. Now, you might almost take this as a classic illustration of the self-other relationship. And I bring it in because Edward Said is, of course, the author, as it were, of the self-other relationship. And the viability of that relationship, its usefulness as an analytical tool, has been brought seriously under question by the accumulating resistance to Said. But what is exhibited in Hegel's treatment of India is a combination of illicit desire and explicit hatred, which is a retaliation for that illicit desire. And the way in which he creates something in order to sweep it aside is almost as if he were casting out of himself a secret attraction which he wishes utterly and emphatically to disown. And that is why his subsequent rhetoric is as ferocious as it is. Now, that's not the only reason for my bringing Hegel into this book, where I think the whole psychology of the relationship, and the psychology as focused on the play of rhetoric, is really quite fascinating. My additional reason is simply that Hegel is a systematic philosopher of some magnitude, indeed of a magnitude which has not since been approximated in the history of philosophy. And therefore his dismissal of India and his treatment of India has to be taken with the utmost seriousness, because it is placed within a kind of philosophical ennoblement. James Mill turns on India, talks about it in much the same way that Hegel talks about it. The transference, the equivalence of rhetorical phrases in Hegel and Mill is quite striking. You could take Hegel's phrases and put them in Mill. You could take Mill's phrases and put them in Hegel, and no one would know that you had transferred anything at all. There was a kind of interchangeability to this rhetoric, which as it hardens and standardizes itself, becomes more and more emphatic. But Mill is dealing with India as a country which has been left behind, as it were, in the march of civilization. England is in the early part of the 19th century. India is somewhere in the Middle Ages, or possibly even further back. India has an enormous number of characteristics which inhibit it in its movement forward. It can only be brought forward by sustained benevolent intervention by a dominant power. Mill actually is not in favor of that kind of intervention. He rather leans to the view that the interface between England and India should be as restricted as possible, that all we need to have in India is the preservation of law and order and reasonably just government, and he would, I think, prefer to leave it at that. But Mill's argument, I think, and his demotion of India and his putting of India back on the historical learning curve and is positive of a learning curve along which all civilizations have to travel, means that India has to be guided along that curve by a benevolent power which is in a position to do so and has, as it were, the moral will to do so. And that takes us directly forward to the kind of attitude which Macaulay takes. Now, Mill does that, but Hegel, of course, gives the whole thing so much more of a deep-set justification by placing it all within the philosophy of history, by arguing that there is at any moment a chosen people, uniquely equipped to carry forward the idea in its self-realization, to inscribe the idea into the workings of history. And a country so equipped has overwhelming rights, which totally obliterate the rights of others. You can see how a doctrine like that is admirably suited to the assumption of an unconditional dominance, which is justified in the name of a chosen people.
So as you see it, Hegel is the philosopher, as it were, who provides the philosophy to justify the white man's burden. May I take it that the Mill you referred to is the historian James Mill?
Yes.
It is rather interesting that some of the most intense denigration should come from Mill and from Hegel, because one would have thought that people who had delved deep into history would take cognizance of the fact that a civilization which had shown such a remarkable capacity as the Indian or the Chinese for survival when other civilizations had perished must have some inbuilt strengths in them. Did they not take that into account?
Actually, the person who takes that into account is Elizabeth Hamilton. The Letters of India Raja has a long preface in which she examines Hindu civilization and its continuity and its capacity for survival, and then asks why this should be, and comes to the conclusion that it is because Hindu civilization has certain inherent strengths. Among these inherent strengths is a singular accommodative capacity, side by side with a tenacity of self-knowledge which safeguards the civilization involved from losing its identity in its various acts of accommodation. That preface is a quite remarkable preface, and to read it today is to understand how it was possible indeed for people to take an altogether different view of Hindu culture. Now, side by side with that, there is another question to be asked. A question which I think the William Jones retrieval of India's classical past inexorably raises, and that is a question of what happened to India? Why has she fallen such a way from what she was? What is it that has brought her from a civilization which was among the three great classical civilizations to the alleged state of anarchy? And I say the alleged state because modern historians are beginning to wonder about that, the alleged state of anarchy of 18th century India. And the answer would then be that there is something wrong with the principles of Indian civilization. There is something which makes progress impossible. And the popular version, or the accepted version of what is wrong, tends to become the caste system, Indian institutionality, India being locked up in a kind of straitjacket from which escape is impossible, unless of course somebody called England comes along and takes off the straitjacket. And so, whereas Elizabeth Hamilton was prepared to see the continuity of Hindu civilization in terms of some inherent strength, these people see the decline of Indian civilization in terms of some inherent weakness. Hegel constructs not just Indian civilization, but all civilizations prior to the Germanic as being caught in a series of blind alleys, each different from the other, but all of them blind alleys, from which they are unable to escape, which is so far and no further. After a certain point, they simply cannot advance. They lack the capacity of self-diagnosis, which would enable them to advance. And only the West, according to Hegel, has the capacity for self-diagnosis, which enables it to get out of the set of constrictions which a given social order might impose, to see what is necessary to get out of the trap you might otherwise walk into, and find something above it, and move to a stage beyond.
I suppose, in a sense, the two world wars into which the West plunged the whole world provided a kind of answer to that kind of optimism. And since then, I think even in the West there's been a great deal of interest in Indian civilization. Your study comes up to Macaulay, but may I take it that before you conclude it, you do come to terms with the significance of your study to our present-day situation. Would you like to speak a little about that?
It does come to an end with Macaulay, partly because I expect to have had enough of the subject by the time I get to that point. I find myself incapable at my ripe old age of taking on everything from Macaulay to Salman Rushdie. But I am aware, as I'm sure you must be aware too, that there has been a revisionist movement in the West. But the West has been aware for some time that there may be something wrong with its fundamental assumptions of progress and of Western superiority. There is doubt within the West about whether the West is on the right track. You might say that there was a movement of Western revisionism. Western revisionism is prepared to give India a space. It is not only prepared to give India a space, it is prepared to give India a space in which India can be commended, looked at, for alternatives, for complementarities, for deliverances which it might conceivably offer. I would say that one of the problems for Indians thinking about India and imagining India at this point in history is to avoid taking hold of the space that is offered to it by Western revisionism and saying thank you very much, and instead to embark upon the much more difficult endeavor of finding its own space and articulating it for itself, of entering this intercultural conversation with a firm positionality. I'm using the Hudson's phrase, a firm positionality which it has itself decided to adopt, of not being a voice in the conversation that is articulated or written by others, but of being a voice that actually contributes something to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Professor Rajan. It's been extremely interesting and thought-provoking having this being in conversation with you. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.